The drive to Aloneatnight Park had been a lengthy one, taking up most of the morning. I packed the car the night before and left before dawn. After 6 exhausting hours on the road, I finally arrived just before noon. Despite the long journey, my real adventure was only beginning. Though I felt tired and slightly anxious, I told myself it would be worth it. Few people had done what I was about to do, and some had even attempted it without ever returning. Still, I believed I would be among the lucky ones who made it back safely from the bothy. I paused the podcast I had been listening to as I approached the small wooden cabin in the middle of the gravel road. "Have you been to the park before?" the woman at the entrance asked. I glanced at her name tag, which read Helen, Park Ranger. "Once or twice," I replied, telling a small fib. In truth, I'd been here dozens of times. "Okay. Don't forget to stop by the visitor center for a map. It's a little up the road to your right. Enjoy your visit." "Thanks," I said, offering a quick smile. "You too." Interacting with people was always necessary during the park's registration process, though I never looked forward to it. Strangers made me uneasy, and I often smiled too widely and awkwardly, sensing their discomfort growing alongside mine. I'd always been more of a loner, and the idea of spending over a week in the wilderness alone didn't scare me. It thrilled me. I couldn't wait to leave everyone behind. I drove further down the gravel road and soon arrived at the log building serving as the visitor center, parking outside. Inside, the place was empty except for an older man, a bit plump with a goatee and a bald head, who stood up as I entered. He wore glasses and a tan park ranger shirt, and he had been staring blankly at the wall before I walked in. "Hey there, how's it going?" he greeted, clearly pleased to have a visitor. "Bob Green, part of the park staff." "Hey, I was hoping to." "Perfect weather for camping," he interrupted. I see you're in campsite 94F, I said, fumbling for my camping permit and awkwardly waving it at him. My lack of social ease flared up again. "Could I grab a map from you?" I asked. "Of course," he said, smiling as he retrieved a folded map from under the counter. "These come free with your entry fee. This one's an overview of the park, but you'll really need the detailed version for your area." After a moment of rummaging through a stack of laminated maps, he handed me a second one. "Here you go. You'll be in this area," he said, pointing to a hand-drawn, waterproof map. The park rangers make these by hand, so they're not always 100% accurate, but they'll help guide you. The big map won't show enough detail, and you'll get lost if you try to use it alone, so don't. He passed the map to me and then began outlining the route I would take, drawing on the laminated paper with water-soluble pens. He reminded me to return the map at the end of my portage and warned me not to smudge his lines. "Careful with that map. If you erase my markings, you'll have to go by memory." "Yeah, wouldn't want that," I said, hoping my voice sounded steady. I had no intention of actually using the map, it was all just for show. I made my way to the canoe launch, loaded the boat, and pushed off into the water. "Stay safe out there," Bob called after me. His voice was loud, and I cringed inwardly. It would be so lovely to be away from him, away from everyone. The canoe rocked slightly as I settled in, but soon I found my balance, and the boat became steady. With a strong push of my paddle, I glided into the water, moving smoothly across the lake. The water was clear, and my paddle sliced through it effortlessly, creating little swirls and ripples as I sped along. Canoeing had been a part of my life since childhood, and now it took no effort at all. My muscles, developed over years of paddling, were made for this. I could canoe for days, probably would, at least while I was out here. The campsite was a mere formality. I didn't plan to stay there long, maybe just for one night. My real goal was to venture far beyond the usual camping areas into places few people ever visited. I hadn't shared the real reason for my trip with anyone. My secret obsession over the last year and a half. I should explain. I've been fascinated by the supernatural for as long as I can remember. Reading horror novels, watching creepy movies, and obsessively following paranormal documentaries and YouTube videos. What really caught my attention, though, was when I discovered the bothy about 18 months ago. Online posts, scattered across threads about Bloody Bobby and the sewer spiders of Louisville, spoke of a hidden cabin deep within Elgin's wilderness. No one knew who had built it, but there were photos and even videos of the cabin's exterior. And there were stories, wild, unbelievable stories. Some people warned against going, but my curiosity won out. I had to see it for myself. Was it real or just a hoax? And it helped that the cabin was located in my favorite provincial park, the one I'd visited since childhood. As I paddled, I let my thoughts wander. The pine trees along the shore caught my attention, and I watched birds take flight. Fish darted through the clear water, and bass leaped above the surface. Occasionally, I saw deer grazing or drinking by the shore. It was a beautiful, peaceful place, and I felt fortunate to be here. Eventually, I reached the first portage and struggled to pull the canoe ashore, weighed down by food, gear, and water. It would be lighter on the return trip, I told myself. I made the trek back and forth along the path between lakes 3 times to transport everything. After a short lunch break, I set off again. The afternoon sun warmed the air, and I peeled off my shirt, enjoying the breeze on my skin. The mosquitoes were thick, but as long as I kept moving, they didn't bother me too much. A couple more portages later, I finally arrived at my campsite just as dusk was setting in. I was pleased with the day's progress and looked forward to setting out in earnest the next morning, heading deeper into the wilderness beyond the designated campsites. I planned to pitch my tent wherever I could find a spot, visiting several different locations I had carefully researched. Before settling down for the night, I knew I had to secure my food. I packed everything into a bag and carried it a little ways from my campsite. After tying a rope around the top of the bag, I hung it from a tree branch, lifting it about 12 feet into the air. The heavy suitcase swayed as it turned, and I tied the rope with a firm knot. I stood back for a moment to admire my work. Bears roamed freely in the backcountry of Algonquin Park, and I knew I needed to be cautious. If I left the food in my tent, it would attract bears, and they might try to get inside. The same applied to any food waste left around the campsite. I remembered an incident from my childhood when I had gone swimming in Algonquin Park and forgotten a box of mac and cheese in my bag. When we returned, the bag was torn apart, and the mac and cheese was scattered everywhere. The bear hadn't been interested in the crunchy pasta, but the experience taught me an important lesson. That night, I slept soundly in my tent, feeling completely secure. I was confident, almost too confident. Little did I know, I had no idea what I was indeed about to face, and I should have been afraid. The following 2 days passed without anything of note, so I won't bore you with the details. The only thing worth mentioning was that the fishing was terrible, and foraging was worse. Despite being the right season for both, it felt as though the land had been cursed. The path I was on seemed to invite misfortune. Every time I cast my line, the fish avoided my bait, swimming away as if it were made of stone. The birds flew off at the sight of me, and the deer vanished into the brush. Despite the challenges, I pressed on, relying on my provisions, telling myself that food would be easier to find further in. I convinced myself everything was fine, even as it became clear that it wasn't. By the 4th day, I was beginning to realize that I might be in trouble, but the cabin was close, and I was determined to reach it. I had emergency rations if it came to that, so food wasn't a significant concern. I reassured myself that people could survive for days without food, though it would be uncomfortable. Instead of dwelling on that, I focused on the wilderness around me. But what I saw wasn't the majesty I had hoped for. The landscape was one of decay, rotting vegetation, mosquitoes buzzing around a carcass on the shore, and carrion birds tearing at the flesh. Dark clouds gathered overhead, casting the lake into shadow. The woods grew unnaturally quiet, and the water lay still beneath my canoe. The lake began to transform into a marsh, just as the online posts had described. The insects came out in full force. Mosquitoes and black flies descended on me like tiny vampires as I paddled faster, eager to reach my destination. I knew I was close now. It was only a matter of minutes before I arrived. When the cabin finally emerged from the mist, I breathed a sigh of relief. It was real. For a moment, I had wondered if it was just an elaborate hoax. After all, when you rely on something you've read online, especially when it's steeped in myth and legend, you never know if it's genuine. But there it was, becoming more apparent as I drew closer, no longer concerned about the insects that were relentlessly biting me. I had worked hard to get here, and now I was finally standing on the threshold of this mysterious place. As I approached the cabin, its details grew sharper. I found a spot to land the canoe and carefully hauled it onto the shore, flipping it over so it wouldn't slide back into the water. Eager to escape the swarming insects, I paused for a moment to take in the sight of the small structure standing alone in the wilderness. Bullfrogs croaked in the distance, and crickets began to chirp. I realized it was getting dark. I had been so focused on reaching the cabin that I hadn't noticed the setting sun. Usually, I would have set up camp before dusk, but I had pushed myself to my limits, both physically and mentally, to get here. An old, battered canoe lay nearby, its hull punctured and worn. I wondered about its story. Why had it been abandoned here? The front steps creaked underfoot as I climbed them, and I tried the door. It opened with a rusted groan, and I stepped inside. The moment I entered, I heard what sounded like footsteps, almost as if someone were leaving through the back door as I entered the front. I paused, listening carefully, but the sound faded quickly, just the soft pad of feet on grass disappearing into the night. Had someone been here before me? Had I scared them off? My heart raced, and if that was the case, I couldn't help but feel a little guilty. It was getting dark, and no one should be out here alone. "Hey, it's okay," I called out, trying to reassure anyone who might be there. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just came here to camp for the night." There was no response. I felt foolish, telling myself that I had imagined the whole thing. There was probably no one else here. It was just an echo or my mind playing tricks on me. I locked the front door behind me and, using my flashlight, began to search through the cabin. There were no signs of habitation, no personal belongings. The cabin contained a small fireplace, and in a stockroom I found a surprising amount of canned food. From my research, I knew that this place was called a bothy, a term I had learned from Scottish hiking culture. These huts were meant as shelter for hikers, but were more common elsewhere in the world than in Canada. This particular bothy, however, had a mysterious reputation. A cabin with no known history. No one knew who had built it or when, and the earliest records of it were only a few years old, despite its appearance suggesting it had been here much longer. There was plenty of firewood stacked beside the fireplace, so I wouldn't have to worry about that for the night. As I explored further, I noticed that the back door was securely locked from the inside. That meant I had definitely imagined the footsteps earlier. There was no way anyone could have closed the door from the outside. On the dining table, near the back door, I found an old piece of paper weighed down by a rock. As I read it, a smile spread across my face. This was clearly a prank left by the last person to stay here. It was a list of rules for the cabin, clearly made up as a joke. The weathered appearance of the paper didn't fool me. It looked more like something from a creepypasta story than an actual ancient document. The rules read as follows. 1. You must share your knowledge of the cabin with others. It needs more visitors to sustain its hunger. 2. Lock all doors when inside the cabin. When you are permitted to leave, the door will lock behind you during compliance. 3. Canned goods must be removed from the pantry before use and will be replenished daily. Do not return half-used items to the pantry under any circumstances. Feed all refuse, including cans and leftovers, into the fireplace. The cabin will readily consume them. 4. The above rule also applies to wood, kindling, lantern oil, cutlery, and other disposables. These will be replenished daily, and leftovers must be deposited into the fireplace. Do not leave unfinished items in the pantry room overnight. 5. Knocking on doors and windows should be expected from 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. Do not open doors or windows during these times. Please do not respond to the voices or answer their questions. 6. You may not leave the cabin until a new visitor arrives. The cabin must have constant sustenance. The last rule sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was wrong here, especially after hearing those footsteps earlier. But I had no other choice. It was just a prank, I told myself. The list was a joke, and the footsteps were probably just an illusion caused by too many days of solitude. That makes a lot of sense, a voice in my head said, but it wasn't my voice. What the fuck? I almost screamed. The sensation of hearing someone else's voice inside my head was unsettling. Something I couldn't quite comprehend. I didn't know how it was happening or if it even was happening. Was I losing my mind? The thought terrified me more than I cared to admit. I waited, hoping the voice wouldn't speak again, and thankfully, it remained silent. I didn't want to open the doors after that, still convincing myself that the list was just a joke, that my mind was playing tricks on me. All I needed was some food and a good night's sleep. So I went to the pantry, grabbed a can of beans, and checked the expiration date. After heating it on the stove, I set the can on top of the wood-burning stove, the crackling fire filling the silence. My mind was still on edge, but I was determined to distract myself. I pulled out my phone and played a game, hoping to forget the bizarre voice I just heard. But I had no cell service, no data connection, no way to escape into the distractions of the digital world. Eventually, fatigue set in and I decided to go to sleep. I unrolled my sleeping bag and curled up, a sense of dread building in my stomach. I felt like I was forgetting something, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. As I drifted off into uneasy dreams, I heard a strange noise. The can of beans beside me began to shake and rattle violently as though something inside it was stirring. Sometime later, I woke to the sound of tapping light, persistent knocks at the windows. My eyes fluttered open, and I groggily started to sit up. "Who's in there?" rasped a voice. "Let us in," another voice added, coming from the front door. "It's so cold," a third voice whispered from behind me. The sound made my heart leap in my chest. There was a boarded-up window directly behind where I slept, yet the voice seemed to come from inside the room as though it was standing right next to me. I opened my mouth to scream, or maybe to speak, but before I could, something caught my eye. The can of beans was moving, tipped over, and something began to crawl out of it. My stomach lurched as I reached for my phone's flashlight. I shone the light on the wriggling creature. It was a giant brown grub, slick and shiny, like something Bear Grylls might eat in a survival situation. My stomach churned as I thought about the fact that I had just eaten from that can. Were the grubs inside it? The thought made me nearly gag. "Let us in," the voice from the front door wailed, followed by the soft sound of fingernails scratching against wood. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, the voice inside my head spoke again. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. Do you need to reread the list of rules? This time, there was no denying that the voice wasn't mine. This wasn't my mind playing tricks. Someone or something was speaking to me. I had forgotten about the list entirely, but now it flooded back into my mind. I'd broken the rule about leaving the can out overnight. What was I supposed to do now? I had skimmed the list because it seemed ridiculous, but now my life seemed to depend on it. The voice sighed. Maybe you should throw the can into the fire and don't answer the voices. Remember, you do know how to read, don't you? Yes, I can read. I snapped. Who the hell are you? How do I hear you in my head? Outside, the scratching stopped. The voices paused, and the silence that followed felt thick with tension. I think you know who I am, the voice responded. You read the posts online. They all said the same thing. The cabin is alive. You didn't want to believe it. Of course, I didn't want to believe it. That was impossible. This was wild. There was a long pause, the silence almost unbearable. Are you going to eat those grubs? The voice asked. If you're not, I'd really like to have them. I stood up, grabbed the can of beans, and flicked one of the grubs back inside. Can't believe I'm doing this, I muttered. This is a nightmare. I walked to the fireplace, intending to throw the can in, but the voice interrupted again. Into the fire. Remember, you really need to read that list again. Assuming you can read. I scoffed but turned to throw the can into the stove. As soon as I did, the stove flared to life, igniting with a brilliant white flame. For just a second, I saw an inhuman face in the fire, skeletal, hollow eyes and a grin that seemed to grow with hunger. Then, just as quickly, the fire died down and the face vanished. The can was gone, too. A strange relief washed over me, the sick feeling in my stomach easing. Ah, that's better, the voice said. Now, the cutlery. Throw it in too. I hadn't even noticed the disposable wooden cutlery, but now that I looked, I saw tiny insects crawling all over it. Ants or termites, maybe. The voice was growing more insistent. Do it quickly now. Otherwise, they'll get inside. I heard the door handle rattling and the pounding on the windows intensifying. I grabbed the fork and spoon from the floor, holding them between my fingers as if they were diseased. Then I tossed them into the fireplace. The fire flared up briefly, then dwindled to a flickering, weak flame. Good, good. You've done well for a first-timer. Only one last thing. Lantern oil, throw it in too. Quickly, they're almost inside. I rushed to the dining table and spotted the bottle of lantern oil. I had used it to refill the lanterns earlier, but I'd forgotten where I had put it. Finally, I found it sitting near the list of rules. I grabbed it and hurried back to the fireplace. A voice echoed in my mind, not the strange one I'd been hearing, but my own, desperately warning me that what I was doing was dangerous. I shouldn't be throwing things into the fire. It was reckless, stupid, and yet, somehow, completely necessary. Don't try this at home. Kids, I thought to myself. I'll admit it wasn't the wisest decision. But I threw the lantern oil into the fire and then scrambled backward, flipping over the dining table for cover. I braced myself for an explosion, some massive burst of fire, like a scene from an action movie. Instead, the fire flared briefly with a bright orange light, then died down almost immediately. That was good. Thank you, the voice in my head said a few moments later as though pleased. Outside, the noises stopped. The pounding on the door and the tapping at the windows grew silent. The eerie stillness returned, broken only by the voice that still lingered in my mind. You did just as I asked. Thank you. Well done. You'll make an excellent pet. And just like that, with those unsettling words, I fainted. When I woke up the following day, my ear was ringing, and a sharp headache throbbed in the back of my skull. When I touched it, I felt a large bump, along with dried blood that had caked in my hair. I groaned as I sat up, convinced myself that I must have fallen during the night and that the fall caused the terrible nightmares. The voice, the grubs, the beans, the people trying to get in. Looking over at where the can of beans should have been, my stomach turned. The can was gone, and in its place were the shriveled, lifeless bodies of the grubs I'd seen in my nightmares. Big, fat ones. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't a nightmare. You did have a few of those, sure, but the real horror. That actually happened. The voice in my head spoke again. I didn't respond immediately. Took me a while to find my voice. My jaw hung open stupidly as I stared around the cabin, searching for the source of the voice, even though I knew I wouldn't find it. It wasn't spoken aloud after all. It was just there inside my mind. Who are you? I asked aloud, my voice shaking. What do you want from me? Oh, I think you know the answer to that already. Just think about it. I paused. He was right. I thought about it long and hard. I had begun to think of the voice as a he because it had a male tone. It definitely didn't sound like mine. You're the cabin, right? I asked, finally putting it together. Bingo! First guess, and you got it right. Although, I can't award you any points for that since you didn't ask it in the form of a question. Better luck on your next guess. The voice had a twisted sense of humor, if that's what you could call it. Demented? Hey, that stings, the voice replied. I didn't call you names after the show you put on for me last night. I remembered everything. The grubs, the fire, the strange events of the previous night. Hey, you saw that? I asked in disbelief. Of course I did. What do you think? I'm watching everything you do. I shuddered at the thought. What is it I need to do? Exactly before I go to sleep? I asked. It's not my fault you humans are so weak, the voice scoffed. You can't even go to sleep without your rituals. I was getting frustrated with its games, but I pressed on. Okay, let's get back to the question, Jack. My name's not Jack, the voice replied with an edge of sarcasm. Fine, whatever. So what do you want from me? I repeated. Look at the list, Jackie boy. It's all right there in front of you. I'm not hiding anything. I stumbled back toward the list, my legs still shaky. The whole situation felt like a dream, but it was too real to be a dream. Scanning the rules again, my eyes landed on number 6. You may not leave the cabin until a new visitor arrives. The cabin must have constant sustenance. What the heck? You mean I'm food? You're eating me? My voice was a mix of shock and anger. Oh, so dramatic. I'm barely taking a few years off your lifetime. You won't even notice when they're gone. And by the time it's all over, you'll have other problems to deal with. You won't even remember this little conversation we're having. His voice was disturbingly cheerful. Oh, sorry. I forgot how touchy you humans are, I muttered. I'm just trying to figure out what the hell is going on. Well, it would be nice if you showed a little kindness, the voice said, almost mockingly. I'm sure you'll start to hate me soon enough, like the last guy did. He was sweet at first, too. But you should have heard the things he said right before I let him out. Let him out? I asked, confused. Oh yes, when you open the front door, it releases the back like a system you humans have. You don't think I know how you work? Did you know that eating actually stimulates the urge to? I trailed off, unsure if I wanted to finish the thought. I know that disgusting fact. How do you know so much about everything? The cabin paused for a moment as if it were carefully choosing its words, or maybe just taking a moment to savor the conversation. Whenever I get a new guest, I can access your memories. All of them have far better recall than you humans can manage. It's given me some fascinating insights into your kind. What are you? I blurted out without even thinking. It was more of a reflex than a question. Such discussions are lengthy and complicated, and they tend to distress your kind. Let's leave it as it is. I am the cabin, and you are my occupant. Sorry for using that P word. I understand now that it's a sensitive comparison, but it seemed apartment. How many guests have you had? I asked, genuinely curious. Oh, quite a few. As I'm sure you've read on the internet message boards, rule number 1 states you're required to share about this place once you leave. And you don't even have to lie about it. I thought back to the posts I'd read about this cabin. None of them had been positive, and yet here I was. It was as if the warnings only made it more enticing, turning it into a dare, a dangerous expedition not meant for the faint of heart. Somehow, I convinced myself it was a great idea to ignore all the advice and come here. Everything felt so surreal, yet it was happening to me, and I just had to endure it. Then, a thought hit me. I hadn't even tried the doors yet. Oh yeah, don't forget to try them, the voice chimed in. They always try the doors. You'd probably be upset with yourself if you didn't at least give it a shot. It was maddening how the voice could always anticipate my thoughts, even when I was actively trying to outsmart it and avoid becoming its next meal. I went over to the doors and tried them. Naturally, they didn't budge. The deadbolts could be pushed open, but they immediately snapped back into place as if some invisible force was pulling them shut. Something powerful, like a magnet. I struggled to keep them open, but no matter how hard I tried, they wouldn't stay that way. "Let me out!" I screamed, frantic. "I'll find someone else for you. Fish or something. I'll bring you food." "No can do, Jacko. Sorry. That's just not how this works. It's not how you want it to work. You're making up the rules as you go along," I retorted. Just look at how old that list is. It's practically ancient. You're such a liar. Those rules were written specifically for you. Was the last guy into creepypasta or something? Oh, absolutely. He was a big fan. He even narrates them on YouTube. His audience is probably furious he's been gone for so long. The more it spoke, the more frustrated I became. The voice answers were just too much, so I decided to stop asking questions and change tactics. I went to the pantry, grabbed a can of ravioli, and used some wooden utensils to start a fire. It didn't take long to get it going, and as before, there was already a tall stack of firewood ready beside the fireplace. It had been replaced overnight. Then, a memory from high school popped into my head. Something about how energy couldn't be created or destroyed. Suddenly, I understood. The cabin was feeding off me. It wasn't sharing any of itself for my benefit, which meant that with every log I threw into the fire, I was burning parts of myself. My energy, my life force, my soul. I was feeding it, bit by bit, as if I were offering pieces of my flesh to a monster. But it was so cold outside now that I couldn't leave the fire unlit. I kept throwing logs into it, all the while hating myself more for each one, knowing it was exactly what the voice wanted. For hours, the voice stayed silent, allowing me to brood in peace. But when I finally realized there was nothing I could do to escape, I accepted the grim truth. I would have to wait for the next person to show up and let me out. And when that time came, I'd have to be ready. I packed up my supplies near the back door like a go-bag, though I swore not to take anything from the pantry. It all felt cursed, and I wasn't about to bring that with me. As I gathered my things, I had a thought. The cabin didn't belong here. There was no trace of its existence beyond a few years ago, and the online posts comparing it to a parasite were spot on. It was like a leech, surviving by draining the surrounding wilderness and anyone who ventured too close. Everything around here looked desolate because the cabin was feeding off it, and the decay would only spread if it stayed. It was a cancer slowly infecting everything around it. It didn't belong in this wilderness. Whatever it was, whether it had come from another dimension or another planet, it was a blight on this place, and it would eventually destroy everything, including the park, and likely spread even farther. I don't like these thoughts, Jack. We've been getting along so well. You don't need to think like that, the voice interrupted. In fact, I'm going to have to ask you to stop. Suddenly, the cabin temperature dropped sharply. I could feel the cold creeping in, and within moments, I was shivering uncontrollably, wrapped in my sleeping bag, which had frozen solid. I can make life here very unpleasant if you continue down that line of thinking, the voice warned. I'm sorry, I stammered, my teeth chattering. I'll stop. The temperature began to return to normal, but it took me a long time to stop shivering. I could finally breathe more straightforwardly, but the voice warned me. Don't cross me, it said ominously. Trust me, you don't want to see me when I'm angry. That was enough to keep my thoughts in check for the time being. As I waited for the next victim to arrive, time seemed to crawl. I had nothing to do. My cell phone's battery died, and my backup power banks eventually drained, leaving me with nothing but my thoughts to pass the hours. I stared at the walls of the cabin, wishing I'd brought something, anything, to distract myself. There were no windows, no way to see outside or know what was happening in the wilderness. I was trapped in this living prison, a place designed to look like a cozy cottage but actually an alien entity eager to consume everything it could. I lost track of time. Days blurred together, and nights stretched on endlessly. I couldn't tell if it had been one day or a month. I only had one indication of time: the banging on the windows and doors every night at 3 a.m. They weren't as forceful as the first night, but they were always insistent and angry. The noise kept me awake and made me think about that first night when the entity had been so desperate to follow the rules, so anxious for me to comply. I wondered about the rules. One of them clearly stated I shouldn't open the doors between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m. But did that mean I could open them outside of those hours? What would happen if I broke the rules? I didn't dare test it, but the question lingered, and I couldn't ignore it. A month may have passed, maybe longer, before I decided to act. In that time, I had learned to guard my thoughts, hiding my true intentions behind a mask. I developed a trick, playing a loop of soothing memories while keeping my secret plan just beneath the surface of my mind, slowly and carefully building it. I knew it would take time, but I also knew I had to be ready when the moment came. I don't know how I developed this skill, but human beings are excellent at adapting to survive. It's one of our most valuable traits. I knew the cabin couldn't see my plan. If it could, I'd already be dead. The thought of that entity controlling my fate was unbearable, and I was done playing by its rules. It was precisely 3 a.m. when the pounding on the doors and windows started again. It had become almost mechanical, like clockwork. The voice had been disturbingly quiet lately, perhaps satisfied with the endless meal I was providing. I had started to lose hope, but tonight was different. Instead of giving in, I was going to make my move. Earlier, I had left a pile of trash near my sleeping bag, discarded cans of beans, ravioli, and empty bottles of water and lamp oil. It was part of my plan, and I knew the voice would be disgusted. I almost wanted it to say something, but another part of me hoped it wouldn't notice. He was so sure of his control that he probably thought I had forgotten the rules. The voice cleared its throat in mock disapproval. "Getting a bit sloppy, aren't we, Jacko?" it taunted. I groaned as I slowly dragged myself out of bed. My mind looped through good memories. Fishing trips, campfires with my family. Anything to keep the plan buried just below the surface. The more I tried not to think about it, the harder it became. Like when someone tells you not to picture a polar bear. "What's that?" the voice asked, suspicious. "What's what?" I said, feigning confusion, picking up a can of discarded food. The pounding on the doors grew louder and more frantic, the windows trembling under the force. "You need to hurry up. They're going to get inside," the voice urged, its tone tinged with a hint of panic. I grinned to myself. "Yes, I can." "Whoops," I muttered, letting it can slip from my hand and spill its contents across the floor. Bugs, grubs, and ravioli rolled across the boards. The pounding intensified, and the voice's tone shifted. "Get those cans in the fireplace already. Those grubs are everywhere." Ugh. Did one go down my crack? Sorry, I yawned. I was stalling, pretending to be half asleep as I picked up the cans. My hands were trembling with anticipation. Then the plan was set in motion. I didn't toss the cans in the fireplace immediately. Instead, I watched the bugs spill across the floor. Termites, spiders, beetles, crawling and scurrying everywhere, just as I had predicted. "I see what you're doing," the voice growled, suddenly aware. "I see your little game." A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was trying to do. But it was too late. The heat in the cabin surged and violently spiked as fire roared in the stove. My clothes were drenched with sweat, and the deadbolt latch grew red-hot to the touch. When I tried to grab it, my skin sizzled against the burning metal. The entity laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that filled the cabin. "You think you can outsmart me?" it jeered. "You're trapped here forever. You're mine now, just like all the others." Suddenly, I heard them, the voices. They were outside, but somehow inside, too. The spirits of those trapped before me, their voices crying out in unison. "Let us in," they pleaded. "It's so cold without our spirits. Please." That was when I remembered my pocket knife. The tool that had been my companion for every journey. The one that had saved me more than once. I pulled it out, gripping it with shaky hands, slick with sweat. I pressed the blade against the red-hot deadbolt, knowing the metal would burn me with every second I held it. My knife began to glow, and the pain from the heat intensified. Every nerve screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't give up now. I fought with every ounce of strength I had, desperately levering the knife against the lock. Finally, with a sharp snap, the door flew open. The undead surged forward, their hollow eyes locked on their goal. They didn't even look at me as they rushed inside, past me, their presence overwhelming. I had no time to think. I grabbed my backpack and ran out of the door, barely avoiding the flames that now raged inside. The undead began tearing the cabin apart, pulling down shutters, smashing open cupboards, and spilling more vermin. The fire in the stove flared, and the insects and rotting food were consumed in an instant. I sprinted outside, my heart racing. Behind me, the cabin crumbled into decay. The fire spread across the structure, fueled by the insects that now infested every inch of it. As I ran, I heard the voice, the one that had tormented me, bellowing in an alien tongue. It was cursing, but I couldn't understand the words. I threw my supplies into my canoe and launched them into the water. The weight of the cabin's presence was lifted from me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. But the journey wasn't over. For 3 days, I paddled through lakes and rivers, fighting against unnatural currents that seemed to pull me back toward the cabin. Every stroke of the paddle drained my strength, but I refused to stop. By the 3rd day, my body was shutting down. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, and there was no food to be found. I started to drift, unable to summon the strength to row. The water carried me wherever it pleased, and I barely had the energy to open my eyes. On the 4th day, I lost consciousness. I awoke to the sound of my canoe drifting away, and the stillness of the water surrounded me. The sky above was clouded, and I felt the weight of the lake pulling me under. I had no energy left to fight. The darkness crept in, and I began to sink. But then, a hand reached into the water and pulled me up. I fought at first, thinking it was the entity coming for me again. But the hand was strong and warm, not cold and alien. I looked up and saw the face of a park ranger, the same one I had mocked, Bill. He had been the one who tried to warn me, and now he was here saving me. "You're one lucky son of a bitch," he said, shaking his head. Noticed your car was still in the lot after your camping permit expired. Figured I'd come out and look for you. I couldn't speak. My body was too weak, but I managed to cough up a lungful of water and give him a heartfelt thank you. Bill looked at me gravely, his eyes filled with concern. Good thing you didn't wander too far, he said. I was about to head back in a minute. I lay there in the canoe, still soaking wet, staring at him. We both breathed heavily, trying to recover from the ordeal. When I asked him what day it was, he told me it had only been 8 days since I had left, but I knew it felt like much longer. The time spent in that cabin didn't count. Or maybe it was just different there. The days blurred into an eternal nightmare. And now I understand why those online posts warned others so desperately about the cabin. It wasn't just a haunted place, it was a parasite. The cabin made you share its story, just like I'm sharing it now, even though every part of me knows I shouldn't. It got inside my head. It infected me. And now I can hear the voices again. They've returned. Thousands of them. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for more stories in the coming weeks. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Take care and have a good night.